So I kept queer, activist, poly, survivor, and mother. Right? Now, from the list that you have now, that was half, just pick one. What is the one identity that you choose today? And when I think about that, activist is the one that I choose from there. Right? That's today. Today I choose that. When I ask people to do this exercise, it's usually really, really difficult, right? Because none of us have just one identity, right? A lot of times society puts one identity on us, whether we're a trans person, a lesbian, a heterosexual person, anyone. There's usually a kind of cookie cutter model of what that identity means, right? So it's really difficult to choose. Today I picked activist because all of you know that I'm trans, that I'm a person of color, that I'm a performer, all of these things, because it was in my bio, right? So you know these things, right? So I chose activist today. If I were in a predominantly heterosexual white community, then I would love to say that I am trans, I'm queer. Those identities mean something to me because I want to be visible. I don't want to be invisible in those moments. So I ask people a lot of the times, when you had to cut it down to the half, what did that feel like? And what did you choose? Was it difficult to choose, or was it really simple and easy? Anyone?
It was tough. It was a little bit tough to really narrow that list.
What about the one, when you had to pick the one identity? It's really hard to pick that one identity, right? Because you leave something behind constantly, right? And I think as trans people who hold multiple identities, especially marginalized identities, if you're a person of color, if you're a person with a disability, if you are a deaf person, a linguistic minority, all of these things are part of you and how you navigate the world. So it's really difficult. So when we talk about visibility, what is that visibility? Right? And we don't live in this world where these identities mean one thing all of the time. Right? It's constantly changing. So this is a shuffle game for me. I sometimes highlight that I'm a person of color, and sometimes I don't, because visibly I think I look like a person of color. But if I was a person of color who was white assuming or white passing, identifying myself as a person of color might be more important to me, right? And for trans people who might passing, identifying themselves as trans might be very important as well, because that's a history for them, that transition. And for others, that might not be important. Passing might be the goal, right? So we don't know. So when we think about this, when someone says that they're trans, there's definitely much more to it, right? Definitely much more. It's much more of that longer list. So how do we view trans identity or transness? Is it a long list? Is it the half list? Is it the one thing? And how does that viewing shape trans education, activism, the trans movement, and how do we change, and how does that change the experiences of trans people? Right? So that's a lot to think about, right? So of course the trans community is very, very diverse. The trans identity is not homogenous, but sometimes we aren't clear on when, it's not clear when the media or national organizations kind of set the standard for what a trans issue is, or who trans people are, or who are being viewed in media, right? Who is making decisions in organizations, who decides what's the most important topic for the trans community, and what does it usually look like, right? So that's definitely things that we need to be thinking about when we think about, you know, if I ask anyone here, what's a trans issue? Would anybody know, like, off the top of your head, what is a trans issue?
Restroom laws.
Restroom laws.
Yes.
Prison system. Hospitals.
Yes.
Violence.
Yes.
Experiences of violence. Housing. Finding housing.
Oh, well, you're all on it, right? Because a lot of times people think trans issues is just specific to transition or gender, which really is a big part of it. But then how do we live in the world, right? In a world that doesn't really want to see us, doesn't notice us, thinks that we are disposable, right? So yes, all of those issues. I say everything is a trans issue. Every single thing is a trans issue. Nothing is outside of that. Okay, so when we're thinking about who sets the agenda or what are the issues that are out in the world, I want to talk a little bit about a survey that came out about 6 years ago. And this is one way that the trans community, or many communities, finds information about who is a part of their community, right? So 6 years ago, there was a study called the NTDS, which is the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. And through the research came about a report, and the report is Injustice at Every Turn. So Injustice at Every Turn was the first survey ever conducted on such a large scale. It got 6,500 participants in the United States, Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, U.S. territories. 6,500, that was huge. No one had ever had a number that large, and most people didn't think there were that many trans people in North America, right, and U.S. territories. And it was the National Center for Transgender Equality and the National LGBTQ Task Force that came together and did that survey. Okay, so I'm going to give you some information about what was on the survey, just to give you an idea. Okay, so like I said, it was a survey that was on paper and on the internet. It was in Spanish and English, and these are all the places where the survey, all 50 states. Okay, the topics that were covered were demographics, education, employment, housing, public accommodations, ID documents, police and jails, health, and family. And some of the key findings were discrimination was just everywhere. Discrimination was felt by all trans people. But one thing was very clear: when you add race to the mix, it becomes even bigger, the discrimination and disparities. So see some of the statistics that came out. Employment, 90%, or most trans people were harassed in employment, mistreated, lost a job, or not hired at all, or they got the job and they were harassed. So a lot of employment discrimination. This talks about the employment average in trans communities as opposed to the national average. And for people of color, it's even higher. Education, this was harassment in K through 12, and the harassment was almost 80%, right, of harassed physically, right. Housing, 90% had been homeless at some point, and at the shelters, it wasn't a safe haven like it should be. Shelters where people were denied shelter, they were harassed while being in the shelter system, or they were sexually assaulted, raped, or harassed in the shelter system. Health, 19%, I would say this is probably higher, were discriminated against or refused medical care There's a funny story, not really that funny, but weird story of a person who went to the emergency room who happened to be trans, had a broken arm, and the physicians there actually said they could not help him because they didn't know trans medicine. It made no sense whatsoever. Because of his identity, they didn't want to treat his broken arm. So, which leads to 50% of trans people had to teach their physicians about trans healthcare. And 28% postponed medical care when they were sick or injured. So they just rather not go to doctors because it became a really difficult thing. And then we have a lot of information about hormone therapy. And what we found about this is, like, not everybody wants to have hormone therapy. Everyone is different. Some people want to have male to female surgery, which is the breast augmentation. You see that 53% want it, 26% do not want it, and 21% have had it. What this tells us is that, again, there's no cookie cutter model of the trans identity. Some people absolutely want surgery. So other people have no intentions whatsoever to have surgery, and that their body parts have nothing to do with how they feel or how their gender is expressed. And so different ways in which people experience that. And even the people who want it someday, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will have it one day when it comes to resources or money or any of that, because it's very, very expensive. Same here. So these are female to male surgeries. And you can see how different it is. And sexual orientation, which was really interesting. Pretty much, heterosexual, queer, bisexual, and gay and same gender loving across the board, right? Some people think that if you are transgender and you cross over to another gender identity that you are heterosexual, but it's much more beautifully complicated than that is, right? It's different for a lot of folks. The GNLS, that is a question that was asked on the survey for a gender not listed here. So they asked the question, how do you identify with any of these gender identities? And if you didn't, they asked you to fill in your own gender identity, right? So 860 respondents wrote in their own gender for that question, 860, which also tells us that the trans community, not everybody identifies as just trans. So for me, I identify as trans, but I also identify as gender fluid, gender queer, and I identify as a transformer because I say I'm more than meets the eye, right? Then there are 500 distinct descriptors of gender, and 42% wrote in genderqueer, and which was also interesting when they did an analysis of race. A lot of times people think that genderqueer is a white term. A lot of people of color actually use that term as well. So these are some of the words or identities that people wrote in for themselves, and I'll just say a few. So hybrid, trans, human, free male, two-spirit, agender, boy-girl, ambiguous. I like gender pirate, that's one of my favorites. I can't say that word, tranarchus, pangender, fluid, no gender. So what this tells us too is that because everything has been so binary, that people are really, really creating language for themselves, right? None of this fits me, so I'm going to create this word, or I'm going to put these two words together to identify who I am now, right? And all of this is very fluid. Gender is fluid. It has the ability to move if you want it to. So I could identify as this now, and maybe later on it will change. Maybe it'll stay the same. I'm not sure, right? But I guess that's the scary thing for folks, that we want things to fit in nice, neat little boxes. We want it to mean this one thing, so it is very clear. And it isn't, and this is what we've learned, it isn't. It's much more complicated, it's much more broader than that.